You know, for decades, we've all been trying to wrap our heads around the link between religious belief and violent extremism. But what if the way we've been looking at it, the very lens we're using, is actually the problem? Let's dig in.
It's kind of wild to think about, but even now, more than 2 decades after 9/11, that one day still casts such a long shadow. It completely shapes how the public, our governments, and even academics think about religious violence. It's become the default blueprint for an entire generation.
So, let me ask you a question. When you hear that phrase, religious terrorism, what's the first image that pops into your head? Seriously, just take a second. Because that gut reaction, that mental picture, is exactly what we need to unpack today.
And look, for most of us, that picture is probably pretty specific. For the last 20 years, the conversation has been almost entirely dominated by one single story: Islamist jihadi groups. That's the narrative that has driven headlines, policy, everything.
But here's the big question. What if staring so hard at that one story has given us a massive blind spot? What if the frame itself is warped, and it's actually stopping us from seeing what's really going on?
To really get why our perspective has been so narrow, we need to rewind a bit. We got to look at the intellectual world that was built right after 9/11, because that's where some of our biggest, most stubborn biases really took hold. And this quote from the scholar Lauren Dawson just perfectly captures the confusion. It says, while religion does not cause terrorism, this does not mean that many of those perpetrating acts of religious terrorism are not motivated by religion. I know, it sounds a little like a brain teaser, right? But it's hitting on something crucial. It's not as simple as A causes B. But, and this is the key part, just dismissing genuine belief as a real motivator is a huge, huge mistake.
And that leads us right to the heart of the matter. The issue isn't just that we're getting the wrong answers. It's that we might be asking the wrong questions, looking through a completely flawed lens.
Now, the academics actually have a name for this lens. They call it normative secular bias. It's a fancy term for a pretty simple idea. It's this default tendency, especially in the West, to downplay or just flat out reject the idea that faith can operate on its own powerful logic, a logic that doesn't fit into our neat little boxes of politics or psychology.
So to get around this bias, it really helps to think about religion in 2 different ways. First, there's the substantive view. That's what we usually think of, what religion is. You know, its doctrines, holy books, its buildings. But the functional view is maybe even more important here. It asks what religion does for people, how it creates community and a sense of belonging, how it drives their actions, and how it shapes their deepest emotions. If you really want to understand radicalization, you have to look at both.
So, what happens when we don't look at both? What happens when we get stuck in that secular bias? Well, analysts tend to fall into the same 3 traps, over and over again. Let's break them down.
We're talking about 3 big ones: the background fallacy, which is all about misreading someone's past; the Western lens fallacy, where we impose our own culture on others; and the ideas versus action fallacy, which totally misunderstands how beliefs turn into violence.
All right, let's dive into the first one, the background fallacy. This is a classic. It's when we look at someone's past. You know, maybe they partied a lot, had a criminal record, didn't seem very devout, and we decide there's no way their religious motivation is for real.
But this is why that's such a flawed way to think. Let's be real, lived religion, how people actually practice their faith day to day, is messy. It's not a textbook. Just because someone wasn't a perfect practitioner doesn't mean their belief isn't genuine. In fact, and this is so important, a sudden, dramatic turn to intense religiosity is often one of the biggest red flags, no matter what they were like before. And you gotta remember, being pious isn't the same as being orthodox. You can be a total heretic to the mainstream and still be 100% driven by your faith.
Okay, mistake number 2 is a big one, the Western lens fallacy. This is where we accidentally put on our own cultural glasses and assume everyone separates the world into religion, which is private and personal, and politics, which is public and practical.
But as Dawson points out here, that neat little split is a pretty new and pretty Western invention. For a huge portion of the world, and for many of these ideologies, that line just doesn't exist. To them, reforming society is a religious project. They're 2 sides of the exact same coin.
And that brings us to our 3rd and final mistake, the ideas versus action fallacy. You've probably heard this argument before. It's the idea that people turn violent for purely personal or psychological reasons. They feel alienated, they want power, and then they just grab a religious ideology off the shelf later to justify what they were already going to do.
But the reality is so much more connected than that.
It's a feedback loop, a dialectic. Those social feelings, that sense of grievance or alienation, they need an ideology, a framework of ideas, to give them meaning and turn them into a call to action. The feelings and the ideas feed each other. It's not a one-way street.
Okay, so now that we've got these new tools in our belt, let's actually use them. What happens when we correct for these mistakes, when we widen our lens beyond that one single story we've been telling since 9/11? Well, the whole global picture of extremism starts to look radically different.
Suddenly, this framework lets us connect the dots all over the globe. We start to see the same fundamental patterns showing up in places that seem worlds apart. You see it in Hindu and Sinhalala Buddhist nationalism in South Asia. You see it in far-right militancy in Israel and the US, pulling from ideologies like Kahanism or different flavors of Christianity. You even see it popping up in far-right groups in Germany, or in the online global community called the Orthosphere, which uses Orthodox Christianity for its political goals.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's pretty simple, really. This fusion of powerful belief and violent action isn't about one religion. It's not about one region. It is a much bigger, much more complicated global thing than our single story ever let us believe.
And this all leads us right up to the present day, where this dynamic is twisting into some truly bizarre and unexpected new forms.
Yeah, you heard that right. Just let that phrase sink in for a second. Militant wellness. It sounds like two words that should never be in the same sentence, right? But it's a very real thing, and it's growing.
And this is a perfect case study in how these new fusions are born. Researchers have even coined a term for it, conspirituality, a mashup of conspiracy and spirituality. It's this strange brew of New Age beliefs and deep, paranoid conspiracy theories. And it absolutely exploded during the pandemic, creating this shocking pipeline between the wellness world and the far right. They found common ground in ideas about purity, fighting a corrupt global elite, and bodily autonomy.
So, let's recap. We've seen how our old framework was just incomplete. We've seen how all sorts of belief systems, from ancient global religions to modern New Age spirituality, confuse with extremism in ways nobody saw coming. And that leaves us with one final and really vital question to think about. As all the old identities that used to hold us together keep fracturing, where is the next unexpected fusion of belief and violence going to come from?